May the words of my heart, mouth, and heart, and the meditations of all of our hearts be aligned with you, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. A river runs through both of these texts. The Nile River in Exodus that baby Moses was lifted out of. And in Psalm 124, a flood, a torrent, a raging water. A river runs through our town. The Connecticut River, the longest river in New England that I think if we watch in the next 5 to 10 years will become a hub of culture in Middletown. And if we are honest and paying attention, a river runs through each of us too. A river that is our force of life, a gift that as long as we are breathing, flows. We could call this river God, a current beneath the surface that propels us forward, that connects us to one another, that keeps us going. Can you feel when your lives are in the flow? Do you know what it feels like to be in the currents of God when goodness propels you forward? There are also currents in our lives that are not of God. Flows that are not holy, that sweep us up, that we don't always notice until we are in deep waters. Subtle racism turned to overt violence, Ferguson. Small habits turn into large-scale climate change. Ways our culture directs us and infects us, that we flow with and that are difficult to resist. How can we tell the difference between these rivers, these flows, these currents that are of God and not of God? In our Exodus story, the Israelites living in Egypt knew which forces and currents were of God and not of God. The new king who rose up worshipped power and fear. He was afraid that the Israelites would outnumber the Egyptians and join their enemies. So he enslaved them, oppressed them, forced them to labor. The text tells us 2 times. The Egyptians became ruthless in imposing tasks on them. But then 2 Egyptian midwives stood as if rocks in the current of this cultural river of power and fear. They were ordered to kill all the baby boys and let the girls live. At what point do we realize that the current we are in is not of God? For these 2 Egyptian women, the line was drawn at the order to take innocent lives. They fibbed to the Pharaoh when confronted. Why did you let the boys live? Because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwives come. Isn't it interesting how ethics can get twisted with God? A value of truth-telling, of honesty, becomes unimportant when lives are at stake. That's an easy one. But on an individual spiritual basis, how do you tell the difference between these rivers in your life? How do we allow the river of God to bubble up and flow out of us and through us, while simultaneously becoming rocks in the cultural rivers of fear and power and oppression? Author and speaker Kate Northrup posted a blog this week exploring a similar question. Is it my intuition or is it my resistance? She asks. And she gives a formula. Here's how to know the difference. She says, on one hand, there's listening to your body, to your inner wisdom, to your gut feeling, your intuition, or whatever it is you want to call your divine instinct. And then, on the other hand, there's the resistance to that divine instinct. And what's the difference? She says that this is something she grapples with daily. She writes, I'm a worker. I can push through and produce. I can caffeinate and make it happen if I need to. I get off in productivity, she says. But when I'm getting a signal that it's time to take a break, to call off the event, to not move forward on a project, I get suspicious. She says, but I found that when I heed that signal, I'm rewarded time after time. Resistance, she says, is when you spend 2 hours on Facebook instead of facing the blank page you've made a commitment to write. Resistance is too busy to exercise when you have a very clear desire to take care of your body. Resistance is saying no when your friend wants to set you up with someone you've tearfully shared with her that your deepest longing is for romantic love, she writes. Resistance is succumbing to the details of your business and allowing them to prevent you from moving forward when you have clear goals. This is how she defines resistance. And divine instinct? She says divine instinct is, for her, canning a project just before it goes out because the marketing feels really inauthentic. Listening to your divine instinct is saying no to a great opportunity, even if it's really shiny and fancy sounding, because it doesn't feel right. Listening to your divine instinct is turning left when everyone else is turning right. Listening to your divine instinct, she says, is canceling a meeting because you could really use a nap. Here's an easy rule of thumb, she said. When we listen to our divine instinct, we feel better. When we let resistance lead, we may feel short-term gratification, but ultimately we feel worse. She invites her followers to tweet. I don't use Twitter. Do any of you use Twitter? All right, we have a Twitter user in here. She invites her followers to tweet, listen to your divine instinct is self-care. Resisting it is self-sabotage. Then she asks, what is your divine destination? Where are you headed in this precious life? What do you really, really want? And I may add, where is your river flowing? The river of God that's bubbling up in you, where is it going? And how do you distinguish the difference? In other words, to pull from our thought to preparation that we heard Julie read, how do we flow with the river of God with no forcing and no holding back, the way it is with children? In a meeting the other night, and I love meetings, which is great because my job requires quite a few of them, we were discussing the possibility of adult education for the fall and landed on the idea of a book study. I expressed desire to create structure, a schedule, a container for this experience, and one wise person from the meeting piped up, saying, you know, I hear churches talking a lot about structure lately. Don't you think we have enough structure? Isn't what we need freedom? Freedom I'll equate with flowing and fluidity. What a good question. Is structure the antithesis of flow, of freedom? Of allowing our rivers of God to flow with no forcing and holding back? I defended my structured position, of course, because as a person who loves going with the flow, I need structure around me. So my life doesn't become one big flow, which would be like a river with no bed, a flood, a marsh, stagnant water. I need structure around me and my community to catch our flow, to allow our freedom to flow. So the book study will be at 6 o'clock on Wednesday nights. And for those of you who aren't able to make it, during second hour, approximately once a month, we'll have a book study review and presentation to share the learnings with the rest of the church. To stick with this metaphor a little further, this calls us at once to be a river flowing freely, and also a riverbed that creates structure and movement for this free-flowing life force. And then in the cultural rivers that we are all in, we are called to be rocks, to provide lifeboats for one another, to call on God as the psalmist did, because had not God been on their side, they write, a flood would have swept us away, a torrent would have gone over us. Then over us would have gone the raging waters. Our help is in the name of the Lord, who made heaven and earth. Author Myrtle Reed, in her book, Old Rose and Silver, observes, the river itself portrays humanity precisely, with its tortuous windings, its accumulation of driftwood, its unsuspected depths, and its crystalline shallows, singing in the summer sun. Aidan Chambers, in his book, This Is All, writes, I thought how lovely and strange the river is. A river is a river, always there, and yet the water flowing through it is never the same water and is never still. It's always changing, always on the move, and over the time, the river itself changes the riverbed. It widens and deepens as it rubs and scours, gnaws and kneads, eats and bores its way through the land. He writes, are people like that? Am I like that? Do I change like a river, widening and deepening, eddying back on myself sometimes, bursting my banks sometimes when there's too much water, too much life in me, and sometimes dried up from the lack of rain? He wonders, will the I that is me grow and widen and deepen, or will I stagnate and become an arid riverbed? Will I allow people to dam me and confine me to wall so that I flow only where they want? Will I allow them to turn me into a canal to use for their own purposes? Or will I make sure I flow freely, coursing my way through the land and plowing a valley of my own? First Church and South Church, let us flow freely with God and be riverbeds and rocks for one another. Amen.